Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
Hi. So this is the part 4 in our series on the question of the orders. So can you give us a very quick summary of what we've covered so far, and then what the next things you want to discuss related to the orders are?
Yes, it's a big question, orders. We will see orders, what we call sometimes directions of movements, and we will see today that also Alexander used sometime another expression. He says instructions. And instructions are central to the way I understand the technique for helping oneself to solve habitual uh, constructions of reactions that are not appropriate. This is not the modern Alexander technique view, of course, because in the modern Alexander technique view that has become really a somatic technique, the orders are just or get their meanings through feeling experiences. So what we've seen already is that Alexander has really worked on this question of instructions and orders in his books, and it's necessary to go back to the theory in order to, in fact, reinvent our practice. This was especially needed, and there was at first very, very few teachers were teaching without hands, without touch. I don't think we were more than 3 or 4. But nowadays, with the COVID-19 episode, where people cannot touch, well, suddenly they are discovering that, in fact, Alexander was quite right and quite modern in his view of developing a technique that the person could use for herself without having a somatic experience beforehand. That it's possible to use orders and instruction to discover new movements that one was well, incapable of doing just before. And it's a means of freedom. It's a means of liberation. So I am slowly exploring the different facets of the orders from the most, we have seen the most simple, and now we are going to, well, to evolve into a different realm that Alexander has pointed to us. The first one is the problem of the model, because if you give orders to somebody to change movements that the person is producing, these movements themselves bringing about a position, an habitual position, well, you must decide what is the model you're following. And the question I'm going to raise today is the model we are following a somatic model, or is it a reason model? Of course, Alexander points to the second option, but it's necessary to understand what are the problems that are, in fact, brought about by these questions. And further, we will see that when we've decided, well, you will see that my opinion is that Alexander really supports the idea that the model we are following should be reason. He's not very clear about how. He just says it is reasoned, and I have point to believe that he has reasoned the model, but he has not explained how reasoned the model to us. So it's up to us to, well, furnish the work that makes it possible to understand the reason basis of the model we are using in order to change from wrong reaction to right reactions. Next, I don't think it will be today, we'll have to see that if the model is reasoned, if we consider that we can give our pupils or ourselves instructions of movements in order to create a whole gesture that will produce different position from the one we are used to. Then there is another question that is raised. It's the question of the memory. In the modern Alexander technique, the orders are so few. There is a neck free, L forward, and back to lengthen and widen that you don't need to develop your memory, your verbal memory, in order to have the orders in mind. they are always the same. There is no question, and the orders are the same for everybody. You will find that Alexander defined the orders as exactly opposite, that they are not for everybody, that they must be different, and different depending on the progression of the pupil toward conscious guidance and control. So then the question of memory is raised. You cannot give series of complex instructions to the pupil and expect the pupil to be able to perform all these instructions together, that is, have all these decision in mind, which means in memory, and then perform these instructions all together if the person has not the means to, well, keep in mind all these instructions. You are asking me to think of so many things at once is always something you will hear during the lessons, or the pupil at one moment or another will find this problem. So we want to see how Alexander explains this problem, and again, he does not give a practical solution to that problem. He asks us to find solutions. So I will of course develop what I have established with my students and pupils. Is that clear? And there
Yes.
are others. You will see instructions will take us very deep into the thinking of Alexander. Well, it's very deep into the writings of Alexander, because he's worked quite a lot. These books are not read very much nowadays, or if they are, it's as if people are not seeing. If you've got a somatic attitude, a somatic mindset, there are many, well, passages that you're going just to skip, I think, because they don't fit. That's my idea, and that explains why there is such a necessity that people think that the Alexander technique is just cannot be taught other than by touch. So when you read the books, these questions is impossible to maintain. And so the prototype. We want to discuss the idea that a specialized technician, like I call it the teacher, knows how to diagnose the different movements a person is making to, in fact, assume the position she takes when she reacts to stimulations. So there is a stimulation that comes very often in our job. It's equilibrium. We are supposed not to be teaching equilibrium, but there is something that is very clear, is that as soon as you change the way a person will organize the movements of the different parts of the torso, the person will have a strong feeling of disequilibrium. Her habitual stability is going to be challenged, very much so. Many times the combination or concerted movement that we are asking the person to perform are difficult to obtain. Not because the movements themselves are difficult. I often shows my people that if I propose a procedure in which the equilibrium is like safer in the sense that the person is not going to feel anything relative to the equilibrium of her stability, then she will be able to produce the gesture and the movement that lead to the gesture we want to see on screen when we control on video whether the person has been able to perform the instructions or not. And then the person is able to perform the instructions. For example, we are going to discuss the coordination of the mechanism of the arm with the coordination with the mechanism of the torso, coordinated the two mechanisms. And it's absolutely obvious. It becomes obvious to my pupils that it's because our feeling of stability or feeling of equilibrium is so strong that very often we cannot, in fact, organize the parts in the way that is the one required in the model. So there is this question that you want to change something, you diagnose that the movements are not correct, that the position is not the one you want. Well, that's what you see. You see the position in place of the different bones of the person, and you're looking at it, you're a specialist, and you are deciding that it's not appropriate. So that means that you have an idea of what is appropriate. So this idea of the disposition of the different parts is what I call a model. It can be understood as a somatic model. That is, imagine that you've met when you were younger a person that had the capacity to, in fact, make you experience the position. What it means is that the person was capable with their hands to place you in the appropriate position. Remember that for Alexander, position is not a fixed organizations of the parts. He's talking about position in going from standing to sitting, position in running, position in going downstairs. So the person has not, in fact, fixed everything so that you were a statue. No, she was able to show you that if you were able to keep the relationship between the parts during a gesture, involving, of course, stability, like going from stand to sit or going from standing to going onto the toes, well, you must assume that that person has a mental plan. That it's not only the feeling that is, so it's the memory of certain feelings that translate into certain position. That's a somatic model. And so there is this possibility. But there is another one, and Alexander is pointing to it. Alexander is not only pointing to it, Alexander is saying that there is only one. It's the reason model. So that what it means is that Alexander reasoned out what were the movements coordination that were appropriate and which were wrong. They were wrong because they created a position of mechanical disadvantage. So from there, I thought that, well, it would be interesting to listen to him and see what he had to say about this model. Of course, most of the time he's not using the word model. I don't think he used the word model ever. It's a questioning that you can bring to his books. If you think of this question of model, what is right? What is the good? I see sometimes modern Alexander teacher questioning. They are asking questions. They say, "What is good use?" Well, it's a first-person experience. Very often, that's the answer. Yes, but Alexander had a technical approach, a mechanical. He's always talking about psychomechanics. These real words are very often found in his first books, in his first three books. Psychomechanics is, he seems to be very interested in psychomechanics, that the psycho is the mental part, the intellectual interest into the mechanical aspects. He often compare the human body. I know that many people object to that, to a machine. But it's clear that we are dealing with physical movements, with bony levers that are pulling on strings, that are pulling on elastic materials. It is clear that we are dealing with mechanics. Kinematics is nothing but mechanics, and geometry is applied to these questions. And it's an intellectual approach. We want to know what is right, not because we feel good when it's done to us. We want to know what is the reasoning behind. And Alexander is talking about his reasoning all the time. So that brought a question. So I started to have in mind to show you, for example, what is happening nowadays. I compare Alexander's gestures, how he moves the different parts. So I'm very interested at the moment to discuss the relationship between the movement of the parts of the torso and the movements of the part of the arm. So that the point is the coordination between the mechanism of the torso and the mechanism of the arm. And we see on the left, Alexander is in fact using his hands. So when he's using his hands, there is a clear relationship between the arms and the torso and the mechanism of the torso. It's absolutely obvious that the upper part of the torso is brought forward and the middle and lower part are brought back. This happens when he moves his hand forward. So next, there is, I've taken a picture from the net where a modern Alexander teacher is advertising her work. So she's seen working. So it's the same thing. She's using the mechanism of the arm in relation with the mechanism of the torso. Yet, there is a completely different approach. We have on the left a gentleman that reason his technique, and on the right, this person has been trained with the touch system, the somatic system. And we see that the coordination of the movements of the different parts of the mechanism of the arm with the movements of the mechanism of the torso is completely different. It's absolutely obvious that Alexander had a model for things like the back to lengthen and widen. And of course, he describes very often the geometry of what is a back that is narrowing and shortening. And guess what? Well, the person that is putting hands on a person on the right is, of course, in a geometry of mechanical disadvantage. There is a very strong compression on the lower ribs. The upper torso is really brought back. The relationship between the upper torso and the middle torso is absolutely clear. It's obvious that the upper torso is going back in space while the middle torso is going forward in space. Yet that person has received three years training where she had a touch lesson every single day. And there is a procedure that Alexander invented, and that procedure, in fact, deals directly, obviously, with this coordination of the movements of the torso and the movements of the parts of the arms. So it's absolutely obvious that there is a difference, and that from these images, it appears that this person has not a reasoned construction of the model of the use of the arms and the use of the torso. So it's good to know that in his books, in his second book, Alexander started to talk about a procedure that somebody that doesn't know would consider an exercise. It's called hands on the back of a chair. And so hands on the back of a chair was a model of the coordination of the movement of the parts of the arm relative to the movement of the parts of the torso. Apparently, if that teacher on the right has done hands on the back of a chair, it must have been on a somatic basis. She must have felt how the teacher placed her parts in space in relation one to the other and in relation with the chair. The chair is just there to stabilize the position of the hands, as the position of the hands are stabilized when you place them on the pupil, just listening, just doing nothing. Just doing nothing with your hands, of course, involves a certain relationship between the movement of the parts of the torso and the parts of the arm. Alexander maintained that when you touch the pupil, you should organize yourself so that you could be lengthening and widening, because he believed that if he was lengthening and widening when he was putting hands on, there was more than the movement of his finger. More, he was like imagining that there was a way to transmit a coordination. And if he was right, you can imagine that the teacher on the right here is transmitting a coordination to the pupil. Yeah, it seemed to be so, because it looks like the pupil that is on the extreme right, that we can't see much, but we can see that the pupil shape of the torso is exactly the same as the as the teacher shape of the torso. So maybe Alexander was right when he said that he was transmitting a more than just the movement of his fingers, more than just the, but he was also transmitting his coordination. Well, if that was true, there must have been a break in the transmission at some point. Because nowadays, when I observe, well, conferences with many modern Alexander teachers, it is very strange, but I don't see this organization with the head so far forward from the back. Most people now have a completely different conception of what is lengthening and widening. And for proof, I presented during a conference in 2015, I presented a model, a drone, and it was copied on this photograph of Mr. Alexander. And a few teachers present in the room. There were 100 teachers, I think, and two or three of them objected and said that this shape, of course, there was no Alexander, it was just a drawing, was completely wrong. That it was absolutely obvious that the head so far forward of the back was like a defect, that this hump seen here was absolutely wrong. Why not? It's possible. But then if you take an historical point of view, it's quite strange, because we have the founder of the Alexander technique in view. I draw exactly the position of the bone as they should be in order to get that position. And when modern Alexander teachers see it, well, they don't recognize this as good use at all. It's just because there is a very recognizable face here that people are going to accept this image. If they see a teacher, or if they see anybody assuming that sort of position, they will find that the person is really stiff, when that on the right is, well, certainly smiling. I occulted the head so that nobody could recognize who the person is, but the person is smiling with a very nice face, and everything seems to be right, and she's an expression of ease, head leading, body following. It's absolutely amazing that the model that Alexander apparently used in order to guide his movements has been totally forgotten and totally transformed by this somatic transmission of somatic teacher to the next, because that's how.
What was the reaction of the teachers at the conference when you revealed to them that it was FM Alexander?
Well, in fact, during the conference, I didn't reveal directly that it was Alexander. After that, I had a heated conversation with two of them, and I showed them that it was Alexander. And well, they were angry, in fact. So when you're angry, it's very difficult to make sense and to bring arguments. So the arguments were just accusation. The accusation most of the time is that I'm trying to sell one view. It's absolutely clear. You cannot, I cannot deny that I am proposing a reason and anti-Semitic view on the work of this gentleman. Yes, that's what I'm doing. That's
and
what I'm saying.
The image of the modern teacher there, that's not an uncommon shape at all in the Alexander technique world. You're not just singling out one person there. That's the shape there is very common.
Yeah, exact. Yes, I have hundreds of photographs like this one. So there is a question of model. if you see that two teachers, one teacher of the old time, Fem Alexander, and one modern teacher, they are both, in fact, selling their technique. And when you compare the model, well, they are different. So that's what I call a problem of model. So that's why I think that the question is valid. We need to ask ourselves, what is the model we are following? And we need to, it's not an indictment. It's not trying to say people are right or people are wrong. It's to say we need to think about these things. It's necessary. That's all. Also, Alexander, I said during, in his second book, prepared the way for teaching people. And he invented a procedure that is very interesting. It's a procedure called hands on the back of a chair. It's a procedure where you are requested to place, to lean forward with the torso. I mean, to incline the torso forward and to place the hands on a chair, on the rail or top rail of the chair. And so this is the central procedure of the initial Alexander technique, this idea that you can, in fact, organize the coordination between the movement of the parts of the arm and the part of the torso in a more easy way to control when you close the system, when the hands are set somewhere in space. That's the idea. I've already explained that we are working with a closed end chain, where we know we want, if you want, that the hand stays in place. That's why you're holding a bar, you're holding the rail of the chair, the hand is set in place, and also the upper torso is going to be, we are going to request the person to think about keeping the torso at a certain distance from the chair. So then the moving parts are easier to control. The moving parts are the forearm and the upper arm and the shoulder blade. The shoulder blade is not apparent, but it will be seen during this exercise that the shoulder blade can move. At first, it will move with difficulty. And this is, I think, the center of this procedure. It will move the difficulty because the person has a certain habit of use of the arm in relation with the use of the mechanism of the torso. I will explain. What you will discover is that if there was a perfect capacity of movements between the parts, you would then find that it's possible to move, for example, the elbow in space away from the torso without the torso going with the elbow. So we call this a disassociation of movement. In the Delsart system, it's a central procedure of the Delsart system is called decomposition. But in English, it doesn't sound very well because a decomposing structure. Decomposition means that for Delsart, a gesture, for example, standing and placing the hands on somebody in front of you is what we call a gesture. It's a full, whole body action. All the parts of the body are involved in this: the feet, the knees, the hips, the middle torso, the upper torso, the shoulder blade, the arm and elbows, everything is involved. Yes, and you have to coordinate the different mechanisms. What we call mechanisms are nowadays designated as a neuromusculoskeletal system. So you have not only muscles, you have also bones, which are rigid levers. And these rigid levers are in fact transforming the action of the muscles. For example, the action of the triceps is going to be very different depending on the angle between the forearm and the upper arm. So these mechanisms are complex. They are very complex. So when you ask a person that is holding the front of the chair to move the, for example, let's say we want to move the elbow forward and down, we are giving an instruction to the person, And this instruction, in fact, entails other instruction that are instruction of definite inhibition. We say, we want you to pull the elbow forward and down, but we want you also at the same time to order yourself not to move the fingers, not to decrease the angle between the fingers and the forearm, and we ask you not to move the upper torso in space. So we are using verbal instructions. This idea of hands on above a chair procedure was, I think, the first attempt by Alexander to really observe his first technique. That is the technique, he says, minus manipulative help. A technique where there is no manipulative help at all. Well, it must have been the technique he used with himself, because he changed his own habits of reaction. And according to the history, no one was around to, in fact, giving manipulative help. So when the person is placing the hands and trying to move the elbows, very often the person gets stuck. And if you observe the scene from outside, you will see that the person is stuck because the shoulder blade is like glued with the mechanism of the torso. The person is stuck because when the elbow is effectively moving in space forward, you see that the torso is going down. So we said don't move the throat down, but the person is moving the throat down. The throat is the upper part of the front of the torso. So you think, okay, apparently the shoulder is stiff. Remember that the muscles of the shoulder, the main muscles of the shoulder, the trapezius, are all related with the head. So if the shoulder is said as stuck, you say that the neck is not free. The neck can only be free if you have a movement, a disassociation of movement of course, the upper arm and the torso. When we were looking at that somatic teacher that was arching the back when bringing the hands forward, it was clear that well, she was trying to maintain her balance because there was some momentum going forward, and she was arching the back. But arching the back meant pulling the shoulder with it, which means that the upper torso and the shoulder were glued. So in that case, we can say that the neck is not free. The head, it's not a question of having the hands on the person and feeling whether it feels free or it feels not free. Most people, when putting the hands on a person, retracting the upper torso back and the head like this, will find that it's not particularly tense. No, it's not free because the muscles of the shoulders, which are part muscle of the neck, are too tight, too short. They are maintaining a stability that is not necessary. So this can only be discovered if during the procedure, the person can suddenly discover that in fact other movements are possible, that the person can suddenly move the elbow away from the ribs without the throat having to follow at all. If the person can discover this, suddenly a conception of the use of the arm in relation with the torso will change. I'm not saying that the person will suddenly be able to, in every situation and every cases, be able to disassociate the two movements and keep the neck free from the interference of the mechanism of the arm. No, but at least the person will have now a conception that our habitual way of using the two mechanisms together is not appropriate. She is starting to form a new model. And that new model is not the feeling that she has experienced when suddenly she was able to move the elbow forward in space and downward in space while the torso stayed back. No, it's an intellectual representation that suddenly something she ignored creates new possibilities. She will have to invest some time and some certainly what we call efforts, because at first it feels like an enormous effort to fight the habitual use of the different parts of the shoulder and torso. When you have been used to holding the torso and shoulder, like the person we saw on the picture, the first time you extend, the first time you create an opposite antagonistic movement between the upper torso and the upper arm, it's like an enormous work. But if you continue, if suddenly this has given you an intellectual desire to explore further, well, the more you explore, the more you will see that your initial response to the new movement was totally inappropriate. That, of course, releasing the movement of the arm from the movement of the torso is freedom, is more capacity of movements, less strain, less ligament problem. It's all that, and it's easy. Once you've passed that transition from the old coordination to the new, well, suddenly it's easy. And suddenly it's even difficult to remember what it was before. I need to have many lessons with my pupils so that I can somehow reenact my difficulties when I started to explore the reason organization of the parts. What this means is that the path of discovery, the path of discovering new capacities of movement is not somatic at all. It's because we have a model, because that model is reason according to the laws of the psychomechanics of the two systems we are considering, because we have instructions of movements that are contrary to the movement that we do habitually, that we suddenly discover something. This transmission is learning. It's intellectual. There is very little physical in this. Yes, and so this, to me, points toward the possibility of teaching without the help of manipulations. So let's start and see what Alexander was saying when he explained this procedure of hands on the back of a chair. So that's what he says. If ever a plan of development by means of exercises to be performed according to written or spoken instruction minus manipulative help is to be evolved, this problem of the amount of physical tension will have to be satisfactorily solved. So Alexander is talking of a plan of development by means of exercises that have to be performed according to instructions. These instructions here sometimes are called orders and later directions, but it's all the same idea. It's and each and every movement can be consciously directed and controlled. It's this idea. And instructions is for directing a movement, and the same instruction is for controlling that that movement has been performed according to the instructions. There is a plan of conscious guidance and a plan of conscious control are all activated with the instructions. So the instructions are very, very central here. So is really explaining that all this, these exercises performed according to written or spoken instruction are done without manipulative help. And manipulative help is not necessary. You can imagine that I was interested in this because what the poor teacher is seen doing with her hands, I was doing exactly the same after my training. It was obvious on the film I was recorded working with my pupils. It was absolutely obvious I had no means of control of my activity when I was putting my hands on the pupils, when it was apparently a clear rule that you should organize yourself when putting hands on people. Of course, I was thinking, I was inhibiting and directing with the same series of preventive orders, neck free and forward and the back, lengthen and widen. It was not working. So I started to invest quite a lot of time in trying to understand this idea of hands on the back of a chair procedure, because I thought that Alexander is pointing the finger, but he's just saying, he says, if ever a plan is to be developed, we have to solve the problem of the minimum of tension. And it's absolutely amusing how he solved that problem of minimum physical tension. He just explained that if you can keep the geometry while you perform the movement indicated by the instructions, then you're obtaining what he calls the minimum of physical tension necessary. What is amusing is that first of all, when you start and try to really control that you are doing what the instructions are saying, you discover that you cannot. It pulls too much. It seems like you are you are dislocating your arms. Does not really match the idea of minimum of physical tension. So the only way to understand what Alexander is saying is that if your habits of use of the mechanism of the torso concerted with the mechanism of the arm is faulty, the minimum amount of physical tension is not going to be reachable directly. There are prevention, there are tension, there are habits of use and conditions of use in the system that are such that you cannot perform the act. That's all. But this does not mean that it's close to you. It means that you must invest time and verify whether bit by bit you can keep the hands in the geometry indicated and keep the torso in the geometry indicated until you're able to, well, organize the pull to the elbow. We will see that he is requesting. It's quite interesting that it's not possible at first to start from this idea of minimum of physical tension. The idea of minimum physical tension is like something, a summit that is somewhere away from you. If you try to start this game by thinking, I should feel the minimum amount of physical tension, you will get nowhere. Nowhere. Because at first, the habit of use of the torso and arm, as we've seen in the picture, is so far away from the correct use of the parts that, well, you cannot obtain it. So this brings us back to the idea of the model, because, of course, it's only if you start to have a reason model that you can continue performing the hands on the back of the chair, despite the fact that you're nowhere near obtaining what Alexander is pointing to, the geometry is clearly indicating, and at the same time, second point, you're feeling absolutely enormous physical tension. So everything is pointing to the idea that if you follow the somatic path, you're not going to perform the hands on the back of a chair and control that the performance is according to the specification of the instructions. That's what I found for myself. So Alexander adds after saying that if ever a plan of development is to be evolved, we have to solve that problem of the minimum of physical tension. He adds, I claim, however, that in its particular application to the evolution about to be described, this problem has been solved, and in a very practical way. And the unfolding of this part of the technique should prove of great interest to the student. You bet. It was of great interest to me. And he adds, special attention is directed in this connection to the instructions given in the following illustration to the pupil in regard to the work to be done with the hands and arms associated with a more or less coordinated body, and particularly to the position of the fingers, wrists, and elbows when placed on the chair as directed. So he's not talking about orders, about directions, he's talking about instructions. But there are verbal instructions, and there are verbal instructions that have an objective. It's the position. I prefer to say the geometry, because most people imagine that position is fixed. Well, position comes from an old word in French, which means to place. So when you say to place, you imagine that there must be a movement or a series of movements necessary to place something. Nowadays, people think that position is something that is fixed somewhere, but it doesn't match. So it's better to use the term geometry, because of course, to obtain the geometry between the finger, the hand, and the forearm, of course, there are movements that are necessary. And it's only through movements and through a combination, a series of movements, that you can obtain the geometry that is requested. And Alexander is saying that this work of the hand has to be associated with a coordinated body. So, well, there is always this problem that Alexander used the term body. He is not talking about the whole, because he's already talking of one part, that is the mechanism of the arm. When he talks about the body in this way, he's talking of the mechanism of the torso. This is a strange thing, but for example, in this same illustration, is asking, the person is sitting, and the person must lean the body. Great care must be taken that in leaning the body, the person is not interfering with the mechanism of the torso. When you lean in sitting, if you lean the body, it must be what I call the torso and the shoulder and head. So this part here is asking us to think that it's not a question of just moving the fingers, moving the palm, moving the elbows. It's how you relate these movements, and how these movements can interfere with the mechanism of the torso or not. So I want to give you an idea, a technical idea, so that you start to understand how the instruction and the model are related, how the teacher of conscious guidance and control must be very clear about his definitions, because otherwise you will instantly encounter problems, because the pupil, of course, has to understand the instruction you're giving. It's I said that we were going to discuss memory, but first, before memory, when I say the instruction to the pupil does not need memory. He needs to understand the instructions. Of course, the two are related, but at the moment I'm telling the instruction and repeating the instructions, I pull the elbow forward, for example. It's a simple instruction. Yet, you cannot imagine how many difficulties this will raise in terms of understanding what is meant by this instruction. So I want to show you well, a procedure that I use that is related to the procedure of the hands on the back of a chair. You see the person is standing, but the hand is not stabilized in space because the person is holding the rail. It's a preparation to the real procedure of hands on the back of a chair. So the person is using a stick under the armpit. There is, of course, the right arm here is placed under the ruler, and the ruler is lifted under the armpit. There is this idea that when the hands is used, we want the torso to be lifted. We don't want the torso to be sagging and falling. No, we want the torso to lengthen. If the torso lengthens when the lower part of the torso is maintained in space, there is only one way this can happen, is that there is going to be a lengthening in stature. And that lengthening in stature should happen on the ribs, but not on the ribs with the shoulder being raised. There is this idea of disassociation of the movement of the torso and the movement of the mechanism of the arm going in the antagonistic direction. One movement is up for the torso, one movement should be down for the shoulders. I've already explained in a previous conversation that there is a mechanism that is relating the arm with the torso through a bone that is attached on the frontal part of the torso. And there is, well, mechanically, or psychomechanically if you want, because you have to translate these mechanic ideas into actions. There is only one way to get the torso to go upward and the arm to go downward. So here, this is represented by the fact that you can impress a direction on the ruler so that the ruler on the ribs is going upward, and we ask the person to find a way to direct the torso backward. So when we use these words backward and forward with our pupil, it's absolutely necessary to understand that these instructions are not evident. They do not come easily to the pupils. So we explain very clearly that when we talk about forward, it's a direction of any line that is 90 degrees to the plane of the ribs and the line of the ribs. The line of the ribs we are talking about are the protruding ribs that we find in the rib number 8. We call it the rib 8 line. And so we compare and we can check whether the ruler is clearly at 90 degrees to the rib line or not. Well, we do because we take a picture, and from that picture, we can see whether there is effectively 90 degrees or not, and whether the ruler and the hand are directed forward relatively to the ribs or not. Yes? In this case, what is happening is that the plane of the arm is also going to be analyzed geometrically. We can decide, and with the pupil convene that we have a spot at the junction between the forearm and the hand, and we want that spot to be directed inward. We don't want the ruler to move inward, but we are preparing a movement of the elbow, a movement of the elbow outward. If the movement of the elbow outward was not met by an antagonistic movement of the palm, well, what would happen is that the ruler would deviate, and it would be seen that the angle of 90 would increase. It's not the point. The point is to keep the hand exactly where we want in space, but still, in fact, indicating that we desire two movements. Why do we want a movement outward with the elbow? It's not only because Alexander said that in his famous test of coordination, the elbow should be outward and the thumb inward. No, it's because we are going to ask a technical question or technical problem, if you want, to be solved by the pupil himself. We are going to ask the pupil, do you think that in this organization, making sure that the hand is not going back, so that the distance between the base of the palm, that is the junction between the forearm and the hand, is going to stay at the same distance from the wall as it is at the moment, do you think it's possible to move the tip of the elbow forward? So forward for the moment is defined as away from the rib line, but for the pupil, this is going to create a difficulty. So it's better to have the pupil standing in front of the wall, the blue rectangle, pictures of wall. Imagine the pupil is standing in front of the wall, and we ask the pupil, do you think it's possible to move the tip of the elbow forward toward the wall without the hand deviating inward, going back or forward? And at first, let me tell you what is the answer of the pupil. The pupil will say no, it's not possible. It means that when the elbow is going to move forward, what will happen is that the forearm is going to push against the wrist, and the wrist will be deviated. So the answer is no. It's necessary to ask the pupil to reason again, because the pupil has no understanding of the chain of segments, their actual movements. Yes, it's absolutely obvious that if you start to talk about a closed chain, that you say, look, imagine that the hand is fixed in space. Yes, imagine that the torso is fixed in place. Imagine someone is coming and taking the elbow and pulling outward. What is going to happen to the chain? If you show a picture where it's clear that, in fact, a shoulder blade is articulated with the top of the sternum, then suddenly it becomes possible to pull the elbow outward. And you will find that if you can imagine that chain and the shoulder blade moving, then you will find that, yes, you can go outward and closer to the wall without the hand changing shape at all. This is the basis of the reason procedure that we call hands on the back of a chair. So the pupil must understand that his reasoning of the movement of the part is like totally attached to his somatic experiences. If his somatic experiences were incorrect because he was stiffening the neck so that the shoulder was fixed with the torso, moving with the torso all the time. When the person was raising the shoulders, he was raising the torso. When the shoulders were going down, the torso was going down. There was no possibility of raising the torso and letting the upper part of the arm go outward. Then the person cannot answer the riddle. To answer the riddle, the person has to change model. The reason model is the way the person is going to suddenly become able to go forward toward the wall with the elbow without moving the hand. That means that there must be a disassociation between the movement of the shoulder blade and the movement of the torso. The movement of the shoulder blade must be allowed to move outward, expanding, so freeing the torso from the pressure of the muscle of the arm. That's the idea. Of course, this is a very simple model. You will understand also that it will be necessary to explain that it's also possible for the elbow to move down. And again, the new movement is only possible to obtain, perform, without changing the shape, geometry of the hands in relation with the torso, without, looking at the orientation system we use. That is, when I say, is it possible to go forward with the elbow? What we mean, in fact, is that we are assuming that there is a possibility to evaluate an horizontal distance. Because here, we can only reduce the horizontal distance if the transverse distance is increased. It's only by widening that you can go forward. But you have to understand that we are talking about an horizontal distance, because here it's simple because the hand and of course the armpit are exactly at the same height. But you don't see here that the elbow is not at the same height. The elbow is much lower. And we are talking about a vertical height. That is the height from the tip of the elbow to the floor. Otherwise, it's absolutely impossible to go forward. So we have to combine. Why is it? And the pupil will ask, why is it that we have to assign a direction of movement to the tip of the elbow that is forward, outward, and down? And that must be explained because this is a reason technique and we can explain it. And it's through this explanation that suddenly the pupil will become able to, well, create a very strong disassociation between the movement of the torso and the movement of the upper arm. So we have the basis here of two things. One is the possibility to instruct somebody into the mechanism of into the coordination of the mechanism of the human structure, and at the same time, well, construct a new model. That's the main idea behind the initial Alexander technique. And I can only imagine that Alexander must have used a system similar to this one. He never really, in fact, wrote about his system. It's a shame. But he's opened the way to us to think in this way and to create a technique of reeducation and readjustment and coordination of the different systems. That's so for today. That wraps the idea that the instructions are related to, of course, a model, and that model is geometric. Yes, and these geometric instructions are a way for the person to bypass the glass ceiling of a somatic cognition. The person has only an understanding of the system through what she's felt, through what she's capable of doing. When suddenly we ask the person to do something that seems impossible, we get a very interesting intellectual ignition. Then suddenly the person reasoning interest into something that look like a physical body work is suddenly to completely change. Is that clear?
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jeando. So the next video will go into the relationship between the orders and memory.
Yes.
But for now, for everyone watching the video, you'll get links to Jeando's websites underneath. And if you want to book a lesson with him, you'll find a link to that. And thank you very much, Jeando. We'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye.
Bye-bye.